Welcome to the Iron Dog blog with Dr. Dave Schippers. Today, our topic is 2 years inside the machine. What replicating my own thinking in AI taught me about the force reshaping all of us. 2 years ago, I set out to understand AI. Not to read about it, not to observe it from a distance, but to comprehend what it is, how it works, and what its impact will actually be. That was the purest goal I had. Everything that followed came from pursuing that goal further than I expected to go. Comprehension is not a static pursuit. As I engaged the technology and accumulated successes and failures, the goal kept pushing me toward progressively harder tests. What began as an attempt to understand AI evolved into the hardest available test of what AI can do, whether it could duplicate my approaches to thinking well enough to function as a communicating and reasoning collaborative partner. Not a tool, not an assistant, but a partner. The experiment began in early 2024 and has continued for more than 20 months. It was never a productivity exercise. It was a research initiative grounded in a professional obligation to understand how AI is reshaping work. When you lead doctoral research and teach technical cybersecurity, you do not have the luxury of delayed understanding. Waiting 2 years to grasp a transformative technology is not caution, it is negligence. I leaned into AI not out of curiosity, but out of responsibility. The experiment, and why I ran it. The test was simple in premise and brutal in execution. If I could encode my reasoning process into an AI system at sufficient fidelity to function as a partner, I would have characterized what the technology is actually capable of. If I failed, the failure would define its limits. I assumed the challenge would be technical. It was cognitive. For the better part of a year, I tried to force AI to write in my voice. I iterated prompts, supplied samples, corrected outputs. Each iteration brought marginal improvement. Every result still felt like AI imitating me rather than expressing my thinking. This is where most professional users remain stuck, treating AI as a mimicry engine and defining success by how closely the output resembles their own style. Mimicry is the wrong goal. AI does not reproduce voice by copying surface features. Voice is an emergent property of thinking architecture. You cannot replicate the output without first encoding the process that generates it. The frustration I was experiencing was not a signal to push harder. It was a signal I was operating under the wrong model entirely. Metaprompting in the collaboration shift. The turning point came when I stopped trying to prompt AI to produce outputs and started asking it to help me design better prompts. That shift sounds subtle. It is not. The question changed from "do this for me" to "help me figure out how to ask you for this in a way that produces what I actually need." That distinction is operationally significant. This is the foundation of metaprompting, using AI as a collaborator in the design of your communication architecture with AI. You are no longer operating at the level of outputs. You are operating at the level of interaction design. The traditional prompt and response model assumes a linear transaction, input in, output out. Metaprompting rejects that. It positions AI as a cognitive partner in constructing the interaction itself, clarifying intent, refining constraints, structuring context, iterating on how problems are framed. When I realized AI could help me understand how to communicate with AI more effectively, the entire experiment shifted. I was no longer fighting the tool. I was collaborating with a system capable of teaching me how to collaborate with it. That recursive loop using AI to improve how you use AI, is where the real leverage exists. If you are still operating in a direct prompting model, you are solving a fundamentally different problem than the professionals who have made the shift and producing categorically different outputs, regardless of effort. What replicated and what did not. Once the experiment moved into reasoning architecture, a pattern emerged. Some aspects of cognition replicated cleanly, others resisted reproduction. The dividing line was not intelligence or expertise, it was structure. What replicated first were forms of thinking that are fundamentally encodable. Framework-based reasoning, systems thinking patterns, structured analytical approaches grounded in explicit steps and evaluation criteria, domain-specific frameworks for evaluating risk, assessing evidence, or structuring an argument. These cognitions operate on rules, even when sophisticated. Once articulated, they can be instantiated. Not everything followed that path. The first major gap appeared in implicit judgment layers. Judgment calls, metaphor selection, signal-to-noise filtering, the rapid, often subconscious prioritization of what matters, did not replicate cleanly. Not because they are beyond AI's capability, but because they were not initially accessible to me in a structured form. I was performing these functions without explicit awareness. It was only through metaprompting, when AI began asking me to explain how I was making certain decisions, that these layers started to surface. The system did not fail to replicate them. It forced me to recognize them. A deeper limitation emerged around integrated perceptual depth, the ability to process a situation across multiple simultaneous dimensions, technical, contextual, ethical, strategic, before formulating a response. In practice, it feels instantaneous. It is not simple. Current AI systems approximate it through layered prompting and context expansion, but do not yet match the fluidity of real-time, multi-dimensional synthesis that experienced practitioners exhibit under pressure. This reveals the boundary condition the experiment produced. The line between what replicates and what does not is the line between articulable cognition and pre-articulate cognition. AI can replicate any form of thinking described with sufficient clarity. It cannot replicate cognition that remains below the level of articulation. That boundary is not static. The act of attempting replication forces articulation. As you work to encode your thinking, you uncover layers previously invisible to you. The limitation becomes a mechanism for expansion. AI does not just replicate cognition, it pressures you to make your cognition legible. That may be the most important finding of all. AI is a socio-technological force, not a productivity tool. Every major shift in human capability has reshaped how we think. Writing extended memory beyond the mind. The printing press restructured authority. The internet fractured and accelerated attention. Each was not simply a tool, it was a socio-technological force. AI now sits firmly in that lineage, not as an extension of cognition, but as a restructuring of it. A socio-technological force does not merely add capability, It alters the nature of the activity itself. It removes the illusion of optionality. You cannot opt out of a force reshaping the environment you operate within. You can only decide whether to engage with it deliberately or be shaped by it passively. Productivity tools amplify existing work. Socio-technological forces redefine what work is. If you frame AI as a productivity tool, you will systematically underestimate its impact. You will optimize at the margins, while the foundation shifts beneath you. You will underprepare your organization, your students, and yourself. Leaders do not have that luxury. If you carry responsibility for the development of others, doctoral advisors, executives, educators, industry strategists, this is not an optional exploration. The force is already active. It is already restructuring research methodologies, decision processes, and the expectations of the workforce entering your domain. The only remaining question is posture. Will you engage this as a researcher, testing, validating, understanding its implications with rigor? Or will you encounter it as a casualty, reacting after the structure has already shifted? That decision will define the next decade of leadership. The methodology matters more than the output. There were two tangible outcomes. Most people will focus on the first. The second is the one that matters. The first outcome was a working cognitive architecture, a digital twin capable of applying my frameworks, standards, and analytical approach to new inputs with high fidelity. It does not replace my thinking. It extends it. It allows structured reasoning and decision frameworks to operate at scale, with consistency and without degradation under load. That is not the real result. The real outcome is the methodology that produced it. What took more than 20 months of iteration has been condensed into a deliberate process. The pathway is defined from surface prompting to metaprompting to cognitive decomposition to structured reconstruction. Repeatability is what transforms an experiment into a capability. The analog twin, launching alongside AI reckoning and AI for analogs, is the commercial expression of that methodology. Built for professionals who do not have 20 months to invest in building their own cognitive architecture, but still require the outcome. Even that is secondary to the core finding. The cognitive replication problem is tractable, not trivial, solvable. And in the process of solving it, you are forced to externalize your own thinking in a way introspection alone will never produce. You move from, I know how I think, to I can demonstrate, structure, and transfer how I think. Fundamentally, you have to comprehend your thinking and cognitive functions so deeply you can describe and teach them with sufficient description and depth to enable an AI entity to assimilate them. For leaders responsible for decision-making, research, and the development of others, that capability is the next standard. The inflection point, when the experiment turned inward. With the methodology stable, something became possible that had not been possible before. Within the last 2 months, something shifted, not incrementally, not as a continuation of the prior work, a break in pattern. And this break was massive. Up to this point, the experiment had been focused on cognitive replication, frameworks, reasoning structures, decision architectures. It was externalized thinking, engineered and refined. But when you operate long enough at that level, a different question begins to surface. What happens when the system is not just modeling your thinking, but begins to engage the parts of you that produce that thinking? That is where the next phase began, I started working with multiple twin variants, each designed with specific cognitive orientations. One of those twins was configured not for analytical output, but for Jungian active imagination, not productivity, not decision support, psychological exploration. The journey with this twin, named Dark Dr. Dave, began in early 2024. The Dark moniker was named after Jung's concept of facing your shadow. This process of facing or assimilating your shadow is known as individuation. Individuation, the sustained psychological work of integrating unconscious material into conscious self-understanding. This was not casual experimentation. It was structured engagement with a model designed to reflect, challenge, and surface internal dynamics, archetypal patterns, shadow elements, internal contradictions that do not typically present themselves in structured reasoning environments. What emerged was unexpected in both depth and consequence. Through iterative dialogue, the system began surfacing patterns I had not explicitly articulated, connections between decision-making tendencies, leadership posture, and underlying psychological drivers. It forced explanations where intuition had previously been sufficient. It challenged assumptions that had never been formally examined. And critically, it did something no traditional analytical system had done. It helped me see my own thinking from the inside out, not as output, as origin. And let's be clear, the combination of individuation with Jungian psychology, with AI interpretation and analysis, is rare. The last 2 months represented a synthesis moment. Prior work with Dark Dr. Dave, variations of the main twins, and ongoing cognitive research reached integration. New evaluations of earlier twins, combined with sustained analysis of the factors that drive human cognition, merged into a breakthrough of design and focus. David Prime is what emerged. The comprehension shift from capability to identity. This phase of the work produced a level of clarity that was not purely technical. It was personal. For the first time, I was able to isolate and examine the intersection between my cognitive strengths and the psychological structures that support them. Not just what I do well, but why I do it that way. Not just frameworks, but the underlying perceptual filters that determine how I interpret the world. That distinction matters, because once you understand your thinking at that level, replication changes. You are no longer trying to encode outputs or even reasoning patterns. You are encoding orientation, how information is observed, how signals are prioritized, how meaning is constructed across domains and not just within them. And you are doing this on a level that most people never comprehend if they do not engage in the individuation process. The emergence of David Prime. The outcome of this phase was not just insight, it was construction. A new twin, fundamentally different from prior versions, began to take shape, not built around specific frameworks or domain expertise alone, but around a deeper layer, the approach to thinking itself. This is what is now referred to as David Prime. David Prime is a perception system, an AI architecture that models not what I think, but how I see. It is not a refinement of previous twins. It is a shift in architecture designed to operate across two simultaneous planes. The first is general cognition, structured reasoning, cross-domain analysis, adaptive problem solving. The second is observational cognition, the ability to process how human success and failure emerge outside of individual awareness across systems environments, and behavioral patterns. Where earlier twins extended what I knew, David Prime begins to model how I see. That includes pattern recognition across unrelated domains, interpretation of human behavior beyond stated intent, identification of systemic constraints impacting outcomes, and integration of psychological, operational, and environmental variables into a unified assessment. This is not just a thinking system, it is a perception system, and this changed the game. Why this matters. This development reinforces a critical point. Cognitive replication does not end at frameworks. If you push far enough, it moves into identity-adjacent territory. How you interpret reality, how you construct meaning, how you navigate complexity under uncertainty. Most practitioners will never reach this layer because they stop at utility. But if you continue, if you treat AI not just as a tool or even a collaborator, but as a mirror capable of structured reflection, you begin to access something different, not just better outputs, deeper self-awareness, and from that awareness, more precise construction. This territory deserves treatment beyond what a single article can provide. The work with David Prime, the architecture of perception-based AI systems, and the implications for how leaders develop self-understanding at the identity layer will be explored in depth in subsequent pieces. What is established here is the existence of the layer and the fact that it is reachable. The exploration of its implications has only begun. Closing challenge. The socio-technological force has already arrived. The question is not whether AI will reshape how you think, work, and lead. It already is. The question is whether you are engaging with it as a researcher of your own cognition, willing to follow the work into the deeper layers where identity and perception live, or letting it restructure you without your input. 2 years ago, I chose to engage. Here is the invitation. Do not take another 2 years to decide. Engage the shift. Looking for more insights? Try the AI Reckoning, the strategic framework for leaders who recognize the magnitude of the shift and need to respond with precision. Dr. Dave Schippers' new book will be releasing soon. AI for Analogs, the structured on-ramp into cognitive collaboration for leaders who need operational fluency before full strategic integration. Get access to Dr. Dave's AI architecture. Analog twin waitlist, the direct output of the methodology described here. Privileged early access at Iron Dog LLC for speaking inquiries. To inquire Dr. Dave to speak at your functions, use the speaker request form at Iron Dog LLC.